So let's start. Well, good afternoon, colleagues here, and also good afternoon to the colleagues that are joining online. Today is the first day of the technical webinar that is titled Securing a Decent Income for Farmers, Metrics and Strategies for Achieving Living Income in Cash Crop Supply Chains. Uh, My name is Carlos Esteban Cabrera, and I'm an economist working at the Economics and Policy Division, ESA, here at FAO, and I will be facilitating today and tomorrow's webinar. And together with Ana Paula de la O Campos, we coordinate what's the technical network on poverty analysis here at FAO. For those that are new, for those that don't remember, what is the technical network of TeamPA? So basically, we've been active for around 5 years already, and we organize webinars and capacity development events at the very beginning related to poverty measurement with a specific focus on rural poverty. And but let's say that the network's been evolving across years. So like in recent years, we have opened or widened the scope of topics that we have been presenting, not only on poverty measurement or analysis, but also on the issues related to rural development that are always related with poverty reduction policies. And so now in this year, we have even a new, let's say, format, and just like probably those that joined it to our first webinar in 2000 in this year, you hear it already, but we are not only organizing this year technical webinars, but also policy webinars. We haven't started yet with this new format, but the next one is going to be in that. So we will keep you updated. And before entering the topic of today's webinar, I wanted to mention as well that we are testing different formats on how to better organize these events. So we encourage you colleagues here, but also those that are online, to reach out to us with suggestions on how to better organize, what you thought about the last event that you joined. So we are always open to suggestions. For those colleagues that are from FAO, we have recently created and put active the Teams channel. So if you are not included yet in this Teams channel, you can reach out to Ana Paula, to me, or the TeamPA at fao.org email to be included. And those colleagues that are not part of FAO, but that would like to follow the events that we organize, we invite you to visit our webpage that I think maybe Ana Paula you can share in the chat, so they can discover where we are located in the web. And well, having said that, I will just quickly introduce the topic of the webinar, because it be very briefly, because I guess through these 2 days we will learn much more and in detail about the topic. But so living income basically is the main topic of the webinar. So why it is important? I guess that we are all that are here, that are seated. We agree that connecting farmers to markets, especially those farmers that are specialized in the production of high-value cash crop, it's vital for their livelihoods, right? However, it's been documented in literature that not all the farmers benefit equally about this connection to markets, but also most important, that the value added that is created in given value chain is not always accrued evenly across actors in the value chain. It's actually, let's say, concentrated in certain actors. At the same time, the literature has also found that, as farmers feel pressure to produce more because their crops are mainly for commercialization, they have exploited the land, and now some value chains are already linked with some issues like in climate change and deforestation. So for this, in order or in response to these issues, but many others that we will learn in these 2 days, the concept of living income has been created and has gained prominence in these last years. And just to define, I think Katya will go in detail today, or the presentation will go more in detail today about the concept. But the living income is defined as the net annual income required for a household in a specific location to afford decent standard of living, including food, housing, education, healthcare, and other essentials. Okay? So this concept was endorsed or created or officialized by the Living Income Community of Practice, who is a group of actors, mainly the Sustainable Food Lab, the German Development Agency, JIZ, and ISC, so who work together to help small farmers to earn enough decent, to earn enough to afford a decent life, right? So to have this, having said that, the concept is not entirely new to FAO, and actually, FAO has already been engaged with the concept and the project, specifically through the World Banana Forum, that we will be also learning more today, because FAO launched the Living Wage Advocacy Initiative, who works to establish living wage benchmark in banana producing countries, mainly in Ecuador and Ghana. So this initiative has also promoted like a multi-stakeholder dialogue and supports fair wage setting across the sector. So having said that, I will stop here regarding the topic, but I will take you through the outline of the event today and what we are going to look today. So I will skip this one first, but what we are going to see today in day one, it's a presentation of a study that has been undertaken by esteemed colleagues here at the FAO and also from the Joint Center Research in Sevilla, who compares different methodologies to compute living income benchmarks, but also provides a deeper look at what is the living income gap. These two indicators are used to assess how much farmers should earn in a specific agri-food or value chain. And then we are also, that would last around 30 minutes. And then we will have three discussions by three key actors in what it has to do with the measurement. And finally, we will have a Q&A section. So to present, the presenter today is Katia Covarrubias, who is part of FAO. She works as economist here as well in the Agri-Food Economics and Policy Division. And she has more than 20 years of international experience in agri-food economics, in development economics. And she defines herself as an applied researcher with expertise in poverty analysis, household income measurement, the design of quantitative and representative surveys in rural areas, and implementation of impact evaluations for agriculture and social programs. Katia holds a PhD in development economics from the Graduate Institute of Geneva in Switzerland. So she will be presenting, and we are very honored as well to have today as discussant first Martha and Richard Anker. They are the co-founders of the Anker Research Institute, who is the institute who has developed one of the methodologies that Katia and co-authors have used to develop this paper. And they both have extensive experience in international, in public health and labor economics. Martha holds an MA in mathematics, and she served as an epidemiologist and statistician at the World Health Organization for over 25 years. Whereas Richard holds a PhD in agricultural economics, and he worked for 30 years as a senior economist in the International Labour Organization. They both have held academic positions in the University of Massachusetts Amherst in the US. They will be providing comments in the first block. Then, happy to have with us Beyene Teklu. He is an associate professor at the Hawassa University in Ethiopia. He specializes in production ecology and resource conservation with a focus on rural livelihoods. He has earned his PhD from Wageningen University in the Netherlands. And his research focuses in the ecological and socioeconomic sustainability of smallholder farming, particularly through living income benchmarking and the cost of nutrition and affordable healthy diets in Ethiopia. Day1 is one of the co-authors of a second methodology that Katia and co-authors have used in the paper that you will see today. And finally, we are also joined for discussion by Victor Prada, who is the secretary of the World Banana Forum here at FAO, who is the initiative that the project and initiative that I mentioned earlier. And he has nearly 3 decades of experience in the food industry. He specializes in the design, implementation, and evaluation of development policies and programs across Africa, Asia, and the Caribbean and Latin America. He holds master's degrees in economics, corporate sustainability, and focuses on fostering collaboration among governments, institutions, the private sector, the civil society, to promote sustainability in the global supply chains. With not further, I will just want to remind the people that have joined online that you can, at any time of the presentations and the discussion points, you can submit your answers through the Q&A section, and we will be organizing these questions and we will be addressing them by the end in the last block. I think with not further, I will stop sharing my screen. I will give the floor to Katia, who has 30 minutes to present. The floor is yours, Katia.
Thank you, Esteban. So I'll go ahead and share just a moment. Okay. So let me adjust that. Can you see my screen well?
Yes, yes.
Okay, great. So, well, thanks for the introduction and also for inviting me to present today. I'm going to be presenting work that's been developed with my co-authors in FAO, Ana Paula de la Ocampos and Ajapa Kamin, in collaboration, again, with other co-authors from the Joint Research Center in Sevilla, Caterina Krombiegel and Pascal Tilly. I think we're all in the audience today, so I hope we have the chance to also include them later. So I'd just like to start off with a little bit of context behind the working paper I'm presenting today. We were tasked some time ago with conducting a cocoa sector living income study focused on cocoa producing households in Cameroon. So I won't be presenting the results of that study in this presentation. Those are being finalized, they're being cleared. But instead, the objective of this presentation and the working paper is to present the methodological analysis that emerged from our background research for that living income study. And that research pointed to multiple approaches for calculating a living income, well, the indicators of living income for smallholder populations in rural areas of developing countries. We ended up mapping out those methods, assigning them formulas, and understanding the data requirements for the different indicators we considered. And that led to the development of a working paper to test the sensitivity of living income indicators to different parameters and assumptions. So the core idea was to systematize the information base and better understand these indicators to better guide their interpretation and ultimately their future use by analysts, by development practitioners, and policymakers. So it's a paper about methods and concepts, and I hope we can take a deep look at that. So just to contribute, to build off of what Esteban already mentioned in terms of the key concepts, I think it's worth reviewing them a little bit more. So a living income is a normative concept, and it's defined as that net annual income that's required for a household to afford a decent standard of living in a specific place. It could also be net monthly. We'll see different reporting units. It entails specific features. It's estimated for a family or a household, which reflects, say, the collective needs of a cohabitating group of people, so that a resource sharing and resource coordination that takes place within a household or a family. It can be contextualized for territorial studies, and that allows it to reflect the heterogeneity of costs that are faced or that can be faced by a specific population in a certain geography. And most importantly, it's not a subsistence threshold. So it shouldn't be confused with the poverty line. It's actually a decency standard. And in that sense, it's worth just quickly looking at what other welfare concepts are out there that are familiar to to poverty analysts and others in this domain. And so monetary poverty sets a subsistence threshold precisely, and it's based on consumption data. Multidimensional poverty indicators are household level indicators of deprivation in terms of access to assets and investments in human and physical capital. On that, whereas living income looks at that decency threshold, defining it using data on costs to identify a minimum income level needed to afford those costs. So it looks at welfare from a different angle. It's worth also pointing out how living income indicators and the concept are actually operationalized and how they're used by those that are looking towards these indicators. So it's largely attracted interest, as Esteban pointed out, in export-oriented value chains of agricultural commodities. So for example, for the computation of fair producer prices, and that's something that'll be looked at in more detail tomorrow when the webinar focuses on reference prices. The concept also has many other potential sources of utility. It can provide, say, unique insights in the domain, for example, of affordability of goods and services, which can provide insights about the supply of goods and services to specific populations or in different places. They can also be used for welfare monitoring, especially for populations with incomes that are below that decency threshold. And quite importantly, it can feed a discussion about the diversification of livelihoods and sectoral transformation policies. So it's a very rich concept with many different uses. As for the key indicators we look at in our paper, there's two specific ones. The first is what's called this living income benchmark, which is that cost of a decent standard of living. It's a normative assessment, but it's typically contextualized to a specific context or population. And it's based on internationally accepted norms of what it means to have a decent standard of living in terms of assets, in terms of education, and in terms of nutrition, for example. So there's four main elements to that benchmark. The first is the cost of acquiring a low-cost, nutritious model diet. And this model diet is something that meets international guidelines for calories and micro and macronutrients while reflecting locally available and acceptable food items. The second element of the benchmark is the cost of decent and durable housing. So decent in the sense that it's of a sufficient size, it's ventilated, there's a certain number of rooms. It can, with regular maintenance, last a certain number of years before it would need to be constructed again. And then there's a broad category called non-food, non-housing, which is essentially all the other goods and services that are inherent in this decent life concept, such as being able to attain a full education for all children in a family, being able to access and pay for full treatment for the main illnesses that are found in a given context, and others such as transportation and clothing and so on. And finally, there's something that we're calling the buffer, which is basically a margin for savings that allow a family or a household to be able to respond to shocks or even maybe carry out investments in the future. The other indicator we look at is the living income gap, which is the difference between that living income benchmark and the total household income from all sources. So if one were to compute the actual income of a given household or a population of households in a certain area and compare it to the living income benchmark, that difference is the living income gap, which is pretty straightforward conceptually, and we can talk a bit more about its implementation later in the presentation. So our working paper tries to sort out how each of these indicators are computed according to the main published methods and the sensitivity of those indicators to different data and assumptions in the computation. The paper doesn't try to propose a new best practice, but it does try to contribute a systematic documentation of what's available in terms of the methods, and create a space to discuss these methods from an analytical perspective using different statistical tools. And we do that taking advantage of data that we collected last year in Cameroon to run our empirical analysis. And that was Initially, a large-scale survey of over 4,000 cocoa farming households in 7 regions of Cameroon that took place in March and April of last year. At that same time, we also interviewed over 200 service providers in the farmers' localities. So while the household survey gave us the data we need for computing actual incomes for the living income gap, the service provider interviews allowed us to then to collect the data we need for collecting a living income benchmark according to the main methodology that I'll be describing in a moment. We then also conducted, a couple months later, in one of the regions where we conducted the main survey, more service provider interviews, more data collection for getting at a living income benchmark, following the guidelines of the second methodology that I'll be presenting in a moment. And so with this information, we're able to test out the formulas that we are mapping in the working paper and conduct different sensitivity analyses. So what are these methods? Our methodological review. So I'll talk about this first in terms of the benchmark and then later on in terms of the living income gap. In terms of the benchmark, our review of the literature pointed to many living income studies with differences in their methodologies and in how they're calculated and so on. But we found that these studies were relying on one of 2 main published methods. The first one, which is certainly the most well-known one, and we have the pleasure of being able to discuss this with the authors, is the Anker Living Wages Around the World book from 2017. This has been used for estimating living wages and also a reference for living income. And it's been applied in different geographical contexts for getting living income benchmark estimates at national, urban, and rural levels. Its computation and reporting is in terms of the per month per reference family unit, and it looks at a nuclear family concept. The other methodology that we found was reported in the journal Global Food Security. It's a 2021 paper by Van de Ven and co-authors, one of which we also have the pleasure of discussing with later. And they've presented an adaptation of the Anker methodology, offering, say, a cost-effective approach for estimating a living income benchmark for rural smallholder contexts in developing countries. The approach is also is computed in terms of per reference households, so reflecting the multi-generational living arrangements that are quite typically found in sub-Saharan Africa, for which this paper is focused. And they report their estimates per month, but per adult equivalent. So there's a different reporting unit applied. However, both approaches are based on a common formula for a living income benchmark. It's a sum of the cost of the diet, the cost of decent housing, of non-food non-housing, and that buffer. But our review pointed out some particular differences, which I'll be highlighting in the next slides. So the first element of that benchmark computation is typically this model diet valuation. So estimating a model diet starts with computing a minimum dietary energy requirement. The Anker methodology does that by referring to Schofield equations for each person type, such as adult males, adult females, children, and then specifying a specific activity level for that MDR, and then the caloric needs, so that MDR for each type of individual in the reference family. They're summed and then divided by the size of the reference family to get at that PC kcal term, which is the calories needed per capita for that reference family. The Van de Ven approach instead refers to an average MDR that would correspond with an adult male equivalent performing manual agricultural labor, as reported by a 2001 study in FAO, WHO, and United Nations University, and that corresponds with about 2,500 kilocalories per day, that AME kcal term. So these are the 2 starting points for computing for then valuing the model diet. So these are different equivalent scales approaches, basically. They're then applied for a model diet. And that model diet, the way it's defined, I won't delve into that here because it's a lengthy process and we won't have enough time to cover all the slides. But basically, that MDER in each of these cases is distributed across a selection of food groups and food items in order to meet a series of nutritional criteria in terms of calories, say from carbohydrates, proteins, fats, different micronutrients. And so the quantity, there's a quantity grams K. So for each food item K, we identify the number of grams that are needed for the model diet. It's valued at a price, a price per food item K, a unit price per food item K. And the sum of all of the valued quantities in the model diet leads to the estimation of that MDEXP term that you see, which is the sum of all that the cost of what it would, the cost of purchasing all of the food items within the model diet. The prices are collected by both methods through market surveys, collecting multiple price points for a relevant selection of food items. And then there's a cost minimization approach that is applied in order to identify which are those lowest, most affordable items for the model diet. So once that MDEXP term, which is in per capita or per AME units, is obtained, it's then extrapolated to the size of the reference family. So in the case of the Anker methodology, it's multiplied by the size of the reference family. So if there's 4 members, it's multiplied by 4. In the case of the Van de Ven method, it's multiplied by the size of the reference family in adult male equivalents. And then augmented to consider, say, the fact that a certain part of food is wasted, there's a need for condiments and dietary diversity, and then put into monthly terms by these additional terms of 30.42. So I just want to go through a quick example to illustrate how this could take place in practice. So suppose we have a reference family with 1 male adult, 1 female adult, and 2 children. We can then we assign caloric values for each of these different adults in the Anker methodology, for example, using the guidance that they've provided and the Schofield equations and so on. We assume 30 to 60-year-old adults with vigorous and moderate physical activity levels, and that leads to different calorie estimates for each person type, J. Those are all summed, then divided by the number of family members, and an estimate of, say, 2,430 calories per capita is obtained. From the Van de Ven method, that initial step is more simple, and we start off with the 2,500. That's the number of calories that are used for the valuation of the model diet, whereas in this example, the Anker methodology would have 2,430 calories for valuing the model diet. And then, so suppose we value the model diet and just hypothetically, we end up with a similar daily cost per person or per AMU. Suppose it's 100 in local currency units in each case. That's then extrapolated by the size of the reference family. So this was 4 in this example for the Anker methodology. That gives us 400 local currency units. And the same family, but put into adult male equivalent terms, has a size of 3.32 units in AMEs. So that, for the Van de Ven method, is how those 100 LCUs would get put into the size of the reference family. That leads to a level of, say, 332 local currency units. So what are initially not big differences in the number of calories results in, say, nearly 20% difference in the actual valuation of that model diet, ceteris paribus. So this is just an example to see how those different equivalence scales play out in the estimation approach. So moving on, in terms of housing, there's fewer differences across the 2 methods. The cost of decent housing assumes in our working paper owner-occupied housing, since that's what characterizes dwellings in rural areas of Cameroon and quite typically in many rural areas of sub-Saharan Africa. So rather than looking at rental costs, it's based on, say, the cost of building and using a decent dwelling, a decent housing. It's based on construction costs, maintenance costs, and usage costs, as indicated here. The base formula is not characterized by any major differences across the 2 methods. Instead, it's the source of the data that differs. So Anker suggests, the Anker methodology suggests that for owner-occupied housing, it's preferable to collect data from construction sector experts, so builders or architects, because there could be a lot of noise if we ask individuals how much it costs to build their own dwelling. The Van de Ven approach instead proposes a sort of demand-side approach and to collect data on the cost of building a decent home from owners, from individuals that actually did do that built their home. So that requires identifying those owners, posing retrospective questions about their housing investments, and obtaining the parameters for this equation through those sources. We'll look at how that plays out when we test the sensitivity of this assumption. Then the other main element of the benchmark is a non-food, non-housing component. And here, both methods rely on a combination of primary and secondary data at different stages in the estimation approach. So the Anker the Anker method relies on the ratio of non-food, non-housing to food expenditure obtained from secondary survey data. It's multiplied by the estimated cost of the model diet to get an initial estimate of non-food, non-housing. Now, that is an initial estimate. It then needs to be adjusted for, say, the local context. And for that, a rapid appraisal of different sectors is conducted, such as health, education, and transportation, to assess the cost of those, of decent health, of decent education, and so on, in the context of the living income study that's considered. So then that's compared to another secondary data assessment of that sectoral expenditure. And if the rapid assessment estimate of the sector's cost is greater than that secondary data parameter, the initial estimate of non-food, non-housing is increased by that difference. So that leads to this final estimate, this third equation on the bottom. The Van de Ven method looks at a starting point instead from the field. So collecting data on decent health and decent education with more field work initially. So that involves interviewing, say, health service providers and education, parents of children with schooling age children. And then that yields the first two parameters of their non-food, non-housing estimation. Then there's this third parameter, other non-food, non-housing, which comprises, say, the transportation, communications, clothing, and that's obtained from secondary data, first looking at existing surveys to get a sense of the share of those other elements in total expenditures. Those are then multiplied by the estimated parameters in the living income benchmark, so the diet costs, housing, education, and health. And then that final estimate is put back into the initial equation to get the final non-food, non-housing estimate. So various differences at different points, different approaches for this element. And then just to recap, this is the full set of differences that I've just covered. And then for the buffer, there's also a difference in the level that's considered. So altogether, we have this graphic in the paper. It is a bird's eye view of the different variations and approaches across the two methodologies with some more details that I couldn't enter into. So if you're interested, definitely take a look at the paper. But what we want to do next was to then weigh in on how much all of these differences, or the main differences, matter for the final estimation of a living income benchmark. So we use the service provider data that we collected in Cameroon to estimate the living income benchmark according to the formulas that represent each method. We then index both benchmarks, so one according to the Van de Ven method, another according to the Anker method. We index them to Anker equaling to 1, rescale them into per capita daily units to compare against the international poverty line, and then graph them out. And what we find is that both living income benchmarks exceed the poverty threshold. So there's a clear difference in the decency concept versus the poverty line. But we also find that the two methods themselves yield estimates that are about 25% different in their levels, the Van de Ven method being a lower estimate than the Anker one. So that brings us to the next question we pose, which is how much or which assumptions and to what extent to account for these differences in the living income benchmarks. So to do that, we run some sensitivity analysis. We re-estimate the Van de Ven benchmark 4 times. Each time we re-estimate it, we take one assumption from the Van de Ven approach and we replace it with an assumption from the Anker methodology. And we hold all other elements of the Van de Ven estimation constant. So we start off with these 2 benchmark estimates. The green is the Anker method, the blue is the Van de Ven. And first we look at how the model diet cost is extrapolated, and we take the approach from Van de Ven and we apply the equivalent scale approach instead from the Anker methodology to the Van de Ven estimation. And when we do that, we find that this different approach explains about 56% of the difference in the 2 benchmark estimates. Our second approach, or our second test, seeks to assess the importance of the price assumptions in the valuation of the model diet. And for that, we take advantage of the 2 market surveys that we conducted. If you remember, one was in April 2024, the other was around May, June 2024. The data comes from the same region of Cameroon. We followed rigorous data collection protocols, including the use of scales to guarantee the correct measurement units for a broad range of food items. And then data processing in both cases was implemented, seeking a lower least cost approach, selecting the least expensive food items within food groups to build the model diet. Nevertheless, the price estimates vary across these 2 approaches. And so we test the importance of those estimates in the benchmark estimation. We replace the Van de Ven price assumptions with the ones we developed for the Anker method. And what we find is that this explains 25% of the difference in the 2 original benchmark estimates, which for us really highlights the importance of the timing of data collection for market surveys, because prices can fluctuate quite a bit over the course of the year. Our third test is to look at the importance of the way the non-food, non-housing element is computed. And so we replace the Van de Ven approach with the Anker method of looking initially at secondary survey data and augmenting with the sectoral post checks. And what we find is that it explains as well around 55% of the difference. And just to point out, these are not cumulative. These are just one-off sensitivity analyses. So we can't sum these differences. And finally, we look at the importance of the source of the data for the housing cost estimate. And what we find when we replace the Anker, when we replace the Van de Ven benchmark housing interview data with those from construction service providers, as we did for the Anker survey, we find that it doesn't make a big difference. So the data was quite consistent across the 2 sources. So now I'll move on to the living income gap analysis. This will be a bit briefer than the benchmark discussion. So this is...
Sorry, just a reminder that you have 5 minutes.
I'll do my best. So for the living income gap, we looked at the literature. We find 2 papers. One is a 2021 from the LICOP, Living Income Community of Practice. The other is a 2022 paper on true pricing methods, and which tries to get at this living income gap for including the social costs in true price analysis. And there's different ways of estimating the living income gap. So it's the difference between the benchmark and the net income level that's observed for a specific population. The 2020 paper suggests 2 different approaches for estimating the gap. One is to take, in both cases, use the living income benchmark is net. The gap is the result of the difference between the living income benchmark for a reference family and the mean or median level of income for the population that's being analyzed. So that's the entire population. It's an average or a median, so the actual outcome will consider the incomes of those that are both above and below the benchmark. Because that seemed like it could underestimate the size of the living income gap, we also looked at a different approach, which is similar to the Van Veen and Galgani paper, but adapted for the objective of really trying to get a precise estimate of the magnitude of a living income gap. And that basically first estimates a living income gap for each household I in the study population. And as first scaling the living income benchmark by dividing it by the size of the reference family and then multiplying it out by the size in adult equivalent units of each household I, and then taking the difference between that and the income of household I for households with incomes below the living income benchmark. So this reflects the actual magnitude of the gap for those that are below the benchmark. Then those are all averaged for all, and we get a mean living income gap. So these are censored and scaled indicators. The third one is a censored and scaled indicator, whereas the first two are neither censored nor scaled. We test this out in practice by estimating income based on FAO's Riga Rulis methodology. It's 20 years of experience in estimating income aggregates in FAO. We compare it with the Anker methodology living income benchmark that we've computed, and we use simulations to test the statistical validity of the living income gap indicators against key metrics axioms from the poverty metrics literature. I won't go through all of this, but basically our findings are that when we look at these four key axioms and we run hundreds or thousands of simulations to reflect the axioms, we find that the mean living income gap is the one that performs the best across the three axioms. It's a distribution sensitive indicator, which allows it to capture changes in inequality over time. Actually, all three of them, two of the three meet this criterion. But in addition, this is a censored indicator, which reflects changes in incomes below the living income benchmark, which is preferable for monitoring purposes. So we have more details on this in the working paper. We can discuss more afterwards what's behind all these graphs. So I'll wrap up now, given that time's running out. And just to summarize the main messages and takeaways from our paper, what we did in this paper, once again, was to compute two main living income indicators according to the main published methods. So we sought to reference those, and it was we went through them in quite a bit of detail. We wanted to put their formulas on paper and test their sensitivity to different assumptions. For the benchmark estimation, we observed some particular features that could be considered for future living income studies. The first of which is the level at which these indicators are reported. We find that this matters considerably for how they can then be used by others. So while the reference family or household approach is useful for quantifying a living income concept, as a metric, it can be also more operable to report in unitary terms that allows for better comparability with existing welfare metrics, which also helps drive home that message that living income is not just another poverty line, but it really it's a bigger concept and a higher threshold, actually. But that also would help gain flexibility when using, say, the living income indicators in other analyses, such as for estimating a living income gap or for other targeting purposes. And in particular, it would speak to the fact that any given population is characterized by a diversity of household structures. So even if we have a most common one, a mean or a median family or households, the constructing a welfare metric that's only computed at the median or at the mean misses the opportunity to be inclusive and reflect the rest of the population distribution. So this the reporting unit could be a simple adjustment, actually, to how living income and benchmarks are expressed. We also observed that the valuation of the model diet is really sensitive to key parameters, and in particular, the manner in which the equivalence scales are integrated to the estimation. Choosing the right equivalence scale matters considerably, but also how it's leveraged for valuing the diet for a reference family or household. But even more so, the importance of price assumptions needs to be taken seriously. We note in the paper, and it's very well known, that prices fluctuate considerably over the course of the year in rural contexts, and in particular in places where agriculture is rain-fed. The lean season is associated with high prices, and especially for the food items that account for an important share of the calorie and nutrient intake required by individuals and by households. So the timing of price data collection is very important. Our own data collection pointed out price variation in a relatively limited period of time within the same region of Cameroon. We were able to corroborate these price fluctuations with other data sources, including monthly price data from WFP and for the most recent household survey in Cameroon. The conclusion is that prices, month-to-month prices, are demonstrably not stable. So choosing the price assumptions carefully is really important for the benchmark estimation. That also raises the question of whether in such contexts a cost minimization approach is relevant, or whether a decent life implies also being able to afford, say, a model diet in periods of the year where prices are higher. Moving on, I see, Esteban, I'm running out of time. A couple more points. We find that the non-farm, non-food, non-housing element is highly nuanced, but it's also a significant component of the benchmark. But given its reliance on secondary data, we also wonder what other methodological developments or data developments could enhance estimation of the component of this benchmark in order to ensure it really reflects a decency standard rather than an actual expenditure standard. Finally, just some last thoughts. There's all of these differences first point to the potential to discuss how harmonization could be introduced into living income methods. One question is whether existing data sources could be leveraged to inform living income studies, which would create positive externalities in terms of cost effectiveness. There's a big global data infrastructure that's been constructed particularly for SDG monitoring, but also for other purposes. And that's invested heavily in harmonized indicators, which are not only quality assured, but normally also comparable across different contexts. One example is the cost and affordability of a healthy diet. That relies as well on the International Comparison Program prices, which could also be leveraged for other objectives, such as using the COICOP codes to get at other estimates, comparable estimates of the non-food, non-housing. We lack data, systematic data for other elements such as decent housing, decent education, decent healthcare. So it seems that there's still a need, an important need for primary data collection, or for seeing how existing survey programs can try to support these data needs for living income studies. But in any case, I think the main trade-off there is when one harmonizes, one loses that territorial focus. When we look at country level, we lose the possibility to really get at those that heterogeneity of living costs that are faced, that exist and are documented within larger contexts. So that's something to consider in this discussion as well. Thanks for the extra time, Esteban, and thanks for your attention.
Thank you, Katia, for the informative presentation. Now we will have the discussion time by Martha and Richard. Just let me share my screen with their presentation.
Okay.
No, you should
Can you
start
start
at
from the beginning?
Can you see the presentation? Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, but from the beginning.
Yeah.
And then put it in presentation. Oh, perfect.
Perfect.
Now it's
Okay.
ready.
Before
Sure.
going into the slides, I didn't realize the audience that was going to be here, and I think we need to just say something right in the beginning about who we are in the Anker Research Institute and the Anker methodology, which I think is not in our slides because we didn't realize was necessary, but that we began this work around 20 years ago. We could help found or partners with the Global Living Wage Coalition, which are 8 sustainability standards group, organizations like Fair Trade, Social Accountability International, Rainforest Alliance, etc. for 8 of them. We have now published around 60 studies of the type that are referred to that you just did in Cameroon.
Yeah, I just want to say something about the Global Living Wage Coalition, why it came together and why we were involved in it, is that the Global Living Wage Coalition came together when they decided to put sustainability, I mean, living wage and living income into their standards. And they decided that they couldn't, each one, like Rainforest Alliance, Fair Trade International, they couldn't compete they didn't want to compete on what a living wage was or what a living income was. They wanted to have one standard that they could work on. And at that time, there was absolutely no international organization who would be willing to take this on. So they asked us whether we would be willing to take on this task. And so we did for the Global Living Wage Coalition. It's very unusual, if I could say, to have an MOU that includes all of these organizations and two individuals, which was at the time, it was just Richard and myself. So, and now we formed the Anker Research Institute in order to be able to service partly the Global Living Wage Coalition, but also for the Living Income Community of Practice, and to service other organizations who want to have a standard, who want to have the same thing in all of their certifications.
Okay, so we'll go on to this, but the book that's mentioned in the FAO paper is available online.
Right.
There's the book.
Here it
but
is.
It's available online for free, downloadable. Okay, so I would say just to start with, thank you, Katya, for your presentation, and you did in most of it, I would say, you did a good job of presenting what the Anker methodology is, because the WUR methodology is, as you point out, a variant of that, of trying to make things more simple, which I don't want to go into how we differ or how I think about that, because that's not the role here. You've done a lot of work on that. Is that we first of all want to say, I think it's great. We really appreciate the FAO doing this work, following the ILO started doing something seriously last year on wages side, and you are now on the living income side. Is that it's going to be very important for the movement of trying to get better incomes for and livelihoods for workers, whether they're farmers in your case or whether they're wage earners in terms of the ILO's case. And of course, I know both organizations, and having been in one for 30 years, they're not so insular to say they're not interested in wages or incomes, either of them. Only interested in one of them. Anyway, you're going to bring greater visibility to this. You hopefully will improve the livelihoods. And I think the global conversation of rural livelihoods is important. And I think, as Katya had pointed out, it's really important to, I think it's another way of looking at poverty. It's not actually poverty, it's sort of like a poverty plus or a basic decency level. So we welcome this idea of what you've done and an exchange. At the same time, you'll see we're somewhat critical of the paper that you just produced, but that doesn't mean that we don't appreciate what you've done or don't want to actually collaborate. Next slide. This is just showing you a small map. I don't think I need to go to, but we have living wage estimates now for 250 locations in 56 countries. And we're expanding that in the next couple of years to hopefully cover virtually all of the global south, including for different locations within countries. So just a little bit about how we do things before getting to your paper, because I guess we're not sure that your what you call the Anker methodology results are Anker methodology results, the way we would do it, the AIM would do it. So from us, the most important is the comparability between locations and within locations within a country, because in global supply chains, there needs to be comparable estimates. So since our book, where we've published these 56 new studies, we have improved our tools a great deal. We do a great deal of training. We do a lot of intense supervision of local studies. And we have a lot of stakeholder engagement, much more than we ever imagined in our book, because we've learned that that's critical to getting uptake and people using the results. And the intense scrutiny and local area and training is we learned that vigorous implementation is really key to the results.
Yeah.
The implementation really matters. Training, supervision, details is that we see many times people going off base. So next slide. So the general comments on the FAO paper. So yeah, I mean, FAO, we recognize your right to do this. In fact, appropriateness, I would say, and so we welcome it. But to be honest, we would have appreciated FAO reaching out to us for clarifications before undertaking the study, before publishing the results. But one of the difficulties or outcomes of that, not doing that, is something quite directed to the paper, that the authors, read our book really carefully. It's obvious, and they were unable to take into consideration anything we've done since 2017. In fact, the book was written in 2016, so it was published in 2017, so it's roughly 10 years. And we've produced so many studies, and we've greatly improved how we implement the methodology. And the fieldwork matters. So here's some of the problems, some general problems with the paper. We went to different villages for the two methodologies. You collected the price data at different months for the two methodologies. Both of those are not, I should say, the best way of going about a comparison. But I think more directly important for us is that we don't know whether you implemented the Anker methodology in a way that we would say it's the Anker methodology. We don't have a model diet. We have no idea what your model diet is. We don't know what the housing standard used was. We don't know what the family size was. We don't know basically anything, and therefore it's very hard to assess whether or not your conclusions are good, bad, or indifferent. They might be, might not be, but the only information that we do have is that you provided was final result of the living wage or living income, I'm sorry, and the prices. Next slide, food prices. And the food prices, if you see it's a second bullet here or tick, is these are some of the differences between the Anker methodology, supposedly, prices, and the WR prices. So cassava leaves were 633 in the Anker methodology and 74 in the WR. Porcupine was 1,667 in the Anker methodology, 313 in the WR methodology, and then most of them were higher in the Anker methodology. So there must be how you analyze the data, I suspect, was the difference. And mango was the other way, 183 in the Anker methodology and 588 in WR. It just means that there's a problem. I don't know what the problem is, but these price differences could not be due to different villages. They could not be due to different months. I know they fluctuate prices a lot. That's why we collect a lot of more prices than we said in our book. We learned that was necessary. But anyway, it doesn't give a feeling about what the result is, and it has a big impact on the comparability. So porcupine is in the diet, then we're obviously much more expensive than the WR, which I don't know the price of porcupine, which one is wrong, or maybe they're both, maybe it's in the middle.
Yeah, the other thing is that we take the least expensive prices at the time. So it could be that if the price raised, cassava leaf was really more expensive the second time, that we might have chosen another product that was there that wasn't necessarily cassava leaf in our model diet. So it's really hard to know or to compare what you did on these two times. And I think you're really comparing apples to oranges.
Yeah.
And we can't sort of say that that is what we would have done. I mean, it's what you did, and I get it, but that's not necessarily what we would have done. And it's not necessarily what we would have accepted if a researcher had done that. Might have sent them back.
Okay, next slide.
Just a reminder, you just have 5 minutes left. Thanks.
Next slide. Okay, these are just some things. I don't think I need to go through most of them. Just that we do not have a rigid set of assumptions, which sometimes comes through in the paper written that way, when in fact all of ours are guided by principles with country-specific results. We don't assume a 50-year service life for housing, as stated in the paper. It's based on information collected. In fact, for Africa, it's often 35 years. And we collect over 1,000 prices in the last 2 studies in West Africa, not 120.
Okay.
Next slide. These are some other things which I think you can read and we can comment on later. We can have our discussions. Next slide. So I think we just got 2 slides left, and this is just how do we move forward. So we would love to support FAO in its efforts to get better livelihoods and to get better and more transparent estimates. Just to point out that our methodology is widely used across agricultural sectors at the present time, in the cocoa sector, in coffee, and in bananas. And you'll hear from Victor Prada on the World Banana Forum. And so we just think that it's really important to ensure consistency in the results. It's really, and protect the credibility and impact for the global agenda, not get to start to argue again about what is a living income. Next slide. And just as the last one, to get within your time frame, our time allowed, is that we put down just some ideas of some technical issues, and that would be what I would have thought would be a good thing to have come out of the working paper that didn't, and it would be very nice if in the future you would revise your working paper when you actually have information you can share about how you estimated the living income, like the diet, and take into consideration some of our observations. But that I think you're talking, I think, of having a meeting in September to look more into living income. There are a lot of topics that we would think are legitimate topics. We don't think that our methodology is so rigid, and there aren't things that couldn't be improved or couldn't be altered in some way to represent better. For example, the WR had a larger amount for emergencies, and that might be appropriate in farming settings. The family equivalent scales that are used, we have I have squirreled away over 1,000 such scales. There are very many scales, and which one you choose is critically important. And I don't think people have been very they've been cavalier, let's say. I think that there are issues about whether farmers pay taxes or not, how you take that into account. We have not. That's maybe not appropriate. Maybe it should be. But anyway, I don't think I need to go through this list more. It was just an attempt to sort of provide some ideas and to indicate our willingness to work with FAO to move forward on some better ideas or better improvements. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark and Richard. Now is the turn for the second discussant, Beyene Teklu. So please, Beyene, you can take the floor.
Beautiful.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity. My name is Bayana from Ethiopia. Thank you all for inviting me to reflect on the paper. I would like to also thank Martha and Anker for writing those previous papers, because our paper was based on their assumptions and papers. So having said this, I would like to thank also the presenter for a nice presentations. That was very nice. And following this, I will give my reflections on the paper with this outline. For general reflections, I think the paper tried to compare and contrast Anker and the Van Dieven approach of living income benchmark is a good initiations to begin with, and also clarify if there is comparisons. But it focuses on the explanations of the methodologies more. That's also very important. The paper tried to assess the commonality and the similarity of the two approaches. So it compares the variations of living income between them. Should have been explained very well, because the context of the two paper and the assumptions of the two approaches to me is quite different. And the paper also did a sensitivity analysis of living income benchmark, which is in fact lead to understanding how sensitive the outcomes are. Again, discussion was presented for the most important aspects of the two approaches, but again, sometimes some concepts appears just in the discussions without it was discussed in the methodology, either in estimations. So those are the major reflections I had. On the introductions, the paper elaborated the need for assessing inequality, the difference between poverty line and living income, but it focused too much on the cash crop, specific areas or regions, West Africa. So I think it would have been good to include other regions, particularly where those studies has been conducted for wider view. It would have been better to reflect that the idea of living income is, to me, a new approach, which a recent history, though we cannot call it a new, but it has a recent history. And so far, different countries, particularly in Sub-Saharan Africa, has been using poverty line widely, which may raise the questions of, comparing the approach to bring what things or what's new ideas in the eyes of policy makers, particularly in Sub-Saharan Africa. Again, lack of interventions, outcome at smallholder level, the lack of clarity on how to translate the concept were actually mentioned as a problem, but complementing it with the recent history and the need to popularizations, particularly the living income of the Van Dieven approach is what is lacking to my knowledge. Living income benchmarking, importance of minimum pricing was mentioned. Some intervention, which may fits well fits to the cash crop farmers or the smallholder farmers who have a very good value chain. Those who are maybe 60 to 70% of their income is generated from a cash crop like coffee, it could be tea. But for those small farmers, particularly in Sub-Saharan Africa, who are non-cash crop farmers, productivity improvement, enhancing input efficiency, and etc., is other views of the Van Dieven approach. for cash crop growers, benchmarking the living income you can apply it for minimum pricing, but for non-cash crop farmers, it's very difficult to bring idea into perspective. The paper presented about 3 objectives, but it lacks a general aim or goal of goal. Generally, just it has a specific objective, but what was really the overall aim of the to me, that was not really explicitly described. To just show you our recent study in Ethiopia, as you can see from the graphs, we assessed the living income. We did a income benchmark for different 9 districts of 5 regional states in Ethiopia. As you can see, the living income benchmark even vary with the regions. So this tells, when we compare it with low poverty and low medium poverty and the upper poverty line, in some woredas, in some districts, the living income benchmark align with per middle poverty line, but in some places it's much higher. So this tells you that it's very difficult to say even living income benchmarking is always higher than or it is better estimates of poverty line. So sometimes it aligns with poverty line based on our recent finding. This paper is being enriched and submitted soon. So I hope it will contribute to the living income benchmark. Just to show how variable even living income benchmark within the same country of different localities, even if you apply the same approach, you see. So variation does not necessarily it's because of the approach, but also maybe due to different context of the specific areas. That's why in my earlier comment, I said it would have been good to include some wider perspective than simply the West African context of cocoa farmers. On the benchmark estimations, to me, it is well elaborated. That is appreciable. It's appreciated that equations developed, models were clear to understand, so that it add value for living income benchmark for beginners. The normative analysis, data source, components of the benchmark, and assumptions of both approaches were elaborated and described well. Here I have any problem. On the living income benchmark methods, the estimations of the Anker and also Van Divan yields very different outcome. The adjustment was actually done to make the comparison. Here is my problem. I like asking you questions. Is that really possible to even compare? Because the assumptions were quite different. In our case, we did in smallholder farmers who are not really engaged much on cash crops. So we use in some cases primary data, less of also secondary data as well to supplement. And the anchors also use their own approach to estimate living income benchmark. So I was asking myself, was like comparing the two was it that was that much important? Is there actually a possibility of recommending a robust approach for living income benchmark? So, and if so, how? So that was not really came out. So the intention of the paper is just to assess the approach. But what is really the takeaway? Is it really to come up with a harmonized approach? If so, that was really implicit in the paper. How robust enough to the approaches are to come up with actually recommendation of harmonized approach also is a question, because as I've shown you in my earlier slides, living income benchmarking with the same approach even varies. So given the variation in contexts and etc., that was my questions. And then on the discussion part, the data source was mentioned, value of supplement and food housing, marketplace, and etc. were described as a point of the focus for further living income benchmark analysis. But why not the primary data collections of other non-food, non-housing cost estimation was recommended, because it will bring a new ideas probably, because so far the non-food non-housing was estimated based on assumptions and there is some calculations. So in our recent benchmark, we collected the primary data, and that shows also quite robust result. Furthermore, the use of income gap analysis for policy recommendation was recommended, together with actually this type of equations like living income gap, generically living income benchmark provided as actual household income. But sometimes, you know, it has to be, this has the actual household income needs to be clear for the readers, because in sub-Saharan Africa, sometimes when you say actual income, it take into account only what is sold, you know. But for smallholder farmers, you know, they consume large amount of the food, which is non-commercial fat. Therefore, I think here it would be good to also mention, sometimes in some analysis, income analysis, people use also livestock as an income. In some places, livestock is taken as like a savvy. So this sections, this area needs elaboration. The paper recommended the use of per capita to express the benchmark and its components. However, wouldn't it complicate diet cost calculations? Because the base for diet cost calculation is energy requirement for individuals, which is for children, adult, male, female, etc. So on the other hand, doesn't it lead to like overestimations of living income benchmark as per capita take into account individuals who are not really productive, for example, children, where we used the assumption behind, we used adult male equivalent is that to just convert the families into productive families, so that reduce a little bit the individuals of the family members. When you convert the adult equivalent, the families into adult equivalent, you can somehow you reduce the size of family size, because if you really simply consider individuals, their food requirement, energy requirement, etc., is different. So a little bit, we thought we'd complicate a little bit the calculations. Also, sometimes it exaggerates gap. Furthermore, the most yeah.
You just have 4 minutes left. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I'm done. Furthermore, the most countries food-based dietary guidelines are really in Ethiopia or in other East African countries. They reported adult male, you know, the requirements, the portion requirement for adult male equivalent instead of per capita, as it measures energy intake of each family members in proportion to energy intake of the adult. So again, healthy diets was recommended to consider instead of tool diet. But doesn't it need validations? Because we are currently comparing both. You know, I haven't seen anything about it in the body of the paper, but at the discussion section it just pop up. So it's good to also see some aspects of it before we really recommend. In addition, the paper does not actually elaborate or compare this affordable or healthy diets with the two living income benchmark approach, and how does it appear in the recommendation section. So it's not clear. So therefore it's good to really reflect it somewhere in the paper. And thank you very much. That's what I have.
Thank you very much, Payenem. So lastly, we have the third discussant, who is Victor Prada. Victor, the floor is yours. Thanks.
Hello, good afternoon. Can you please confirm if you can hear me appropriately?
Yeah.
Okay, let me share my screen. Can you please confirm, Esteban, if you can see my screen?
Yeah, we can see it now. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Perfect. Okay, so again, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much. My name is Victor Prada, and well, Esteban introduced me before, so I'm honored to speak on behalf of the World Banana Forum to share our efforts on and experiences, and also the work we've been doing for the last 10 years, I would say, on living income and living wages in the banana industry. So I will try to give you some of this information in 10 minutes and walk you through this slide that we prepared, focusing on key challenges for smallholders and how living income matters for the banana industry and how the World Banana Forum is working to make tangible results. This timeline shows how the World Banana Forum was steadily moving in the direction of living wages and living income over the last 10 years, as mentioned before. Back in 2015, we've initiated what we call LIWIN, the Living Income Advocacy Initiative, in Ecuador and Ghana to explore baseline studies and methodologies. By 2017, we had established living wage benchmark in both Ecuador and Ghana, which led to a broader consultation process in 2018. And in 2019, we proposed expanding the studies on living wages and living income to cover 8 countries more. Despite several challenges, because back then the Green Deal was starting, as you know, and we had the COVID pandemic right after in 2020. So we've continued innovating and eventually launching, and also an observatory on cost-sustainable production to support these activities to evaluate the price of the banana box, both from farmers and living income and from plantations considering living wages. So in 2000, and this is the most important part, in 2022, members of the World Banana Forum requested the World Banana Forum platform to form a dedicated living wage commission, living wage and income commission. So we've formalized such a group or such a platform in 2023 to unify efforts from different institutions, because it was a bit misleading for producers and their governments to just follow up on the different methodologies and different activities done by different stakeholders or different countries. The Ankers mentioned before about the Global Living Wage Coalition. By the way, thank you very much to Richard and Marta, and also to Katia and our colleague Beijing for their presentation. It was really insightful. We know each other for quite a long time. So it was, again, good to talk go back again to what we did in the past, especially with the Global Living Wage Coalition. I think it was a unique example of pre-competitive cooperation where different certification schemes decided to get together to agree on the same methodology and definition, and therefore have the capacity to compare, which is what we thought it was very interesting back in 2015 and 16. That's something that Richard mentioned before. So I think that's also important, in order to be able to compare or to see if this will be useful for trade, for the market in the future. So then we've created this commission on living wages and 2 subgroups, one on markets and the other one on methodologies and tools. So let's begin with the central role of smallholders for the discussion today, and this role they play in global banana exports. So in main banana producing countries, bananas serve as both a staple crop and cash crop, as you know, and often represent around 75% of the household income. So over 90% of bananas for export are originate from Latin America and the Caribbean, parts of Asia, with small-scale farms accounting for a substantial portion of that supply. So it's very important not only to address the issues on living wages, but also to address the issues on living income. So because we aim in the World Banana Forum to have this resilient banana sector. Then main challenges for smallholders, as you can imagine, is financial barriers. Many farmers struggle to access affordable credit, financing, and that is a limit for their capacity to innovate on agricultural practices, better wages, etc. Then climate and disease risk, and also market constraints. Smallholders often have limited bargaining power. That's one of the main activities that we do in the World Banana Forum. Is an important component of the agenda of the World Banana Forum. And they face volatile global prices, and then high transition cost, and then other factors such as the profits, and effectiveness in plantations. So address all this is very important, and that's also why the living income is very important for the industry. And that was the kind of the introduction on why Banana and the World Banana Forum is involved in these activities on living income and living wages for the last 10 years. Then current activities in the World Banana Forum, we pursue these 3 strategic lines of work. Then we review living income implementation experiences. So we analyze how similar concepts have been applied in other commodities such as cocoa, coffee, and other industries to glean best practices for bananas. Then second, we work on methodologies and tools. As mentioned before, we even have a dedicated subgroup under the Living Wage Commission to analyze tools, and we discuss those, of course, in a very inclusive manner with all the constituencies in the World Banana Forum in our meetings. And then our team is mapping existing frameworks for measuring household income and identify income gaps and living wage gaps and determine reference prices, such as one member of the World Banana Forum is Fairtrade, and they have these activities on reference prices, so we also analyze those activities. Then we also work on data harmonization and publications, so we recognize that inconsistent figures create confusion, and so we aim to align living income and living wage data for banana producing regions under a single, and if it's possible, transparent framework. Then let's go into business. What we analyze, this slide highlights the various methodologies and tools currently used to analyze living income gaps, or at least the ones that could be useful for the banana industry, but particularly in a smallholder farming contexts, like as mentioned before, like bananas in many locations. So on the left, you see a range of methodologies, for instance, living income community of practice and guidance materials, the Fairtrade and GLZ framework for living income reference prices, and others like True Price or Fairfood, the Cocoa Barometer, or Oxfam. So these methodologies each propose unique assumptions, data requirements, and conceptual frameworks for measuring or defining a living income. And on the right side of the table, we have the corresponding tools, the operational side of those methodologies. For example, Fairtrade and GIZ, they have the living income reference price estimations or calculators, while IDH offers the income driver tool and living income measurement guide. So these tools typically allow stakeholders, farmers, cooperatives, NGOs, or researchers to collect and interpret data on household income, identify gaps, and also in some cases calculate the reference price for different commodities. So True Price and Fairfood are developing, as far as we are concerned. So this is our study. This is not the FAO approach. Is a work that has been conducted by the World Banana Forum. So apologies if there are new developments. But as far as we are concerned, True Price and Fairfood, they have a new, or they are working on how to develop new reference price tools and how to show that methodological innovation is ongoing and it's maybe necessary. So in short, these methodologies and tools don't always match one-to-one, but they collectively represent the building blocks that can be used for more precise and transparent living income analysis. So something that is increasingly critical for sustainability and fairness in the banana industry. Then here you can find the different organizations and their approaches on living income reference prices, calculations, and the assumptions they use. So most of these methodologies use the Anker, the ARI, or the Anker Research Institute estimations for living income and as an input. On the left, you can see Fairtrade and GIZ emphasizing the labor requirements approach with two main production scenarios, one reflecting business as usual, and the other one representing the good agricultural practices. Both involve on-the-ground data collection, very important. Not all of them have to follow this approach, but then it's on-the-ground data collection, and they work closely with the stakeholders, leading to farm gate from FOB, reference prices. In contrast, True Price and Fair Food, they adopt the income share perspective. So they factor in what a portion of the household total income comes from a particular commodity. So it's not only one commodity, it's a different approach. And then there's a farmer-centric dimension, as their data gathering strongly involves producers directly. So these methodologies can yield different result levels, ranging from farm gate to cooperative level to full study supply chain specific benchmarks. And then finally, the Cocoa Barometer and Oxfam also employ income share model, typically referencing the prevailing production system and often resulting on farm gate level calculations. So this table highlights that not all the methodologies operate in the same way. Some rely heavily on labor assumptions and best practices, while others focus on proportional income share. In each case, the choice of banana production scenario and data collection methods shapes how reference prices are ultimately determined.
Victor?
Hello?
Sorry, you have 4 minutes left. Thanks.
Sure,
Just-
I will finish. Thank you, Esteban. Then, so turning to the actual tools, some like the GIZ estimator, those are publicly available. Also very important, the anchors, all the resources that they have are publicly available. We had a long discussion on benchmarks available and then different benchmarks and methodologies, but there's an important factor that it's in occasions not over the table, which is what we really have available for free, because there are methodologies and studies and figures that are not publicly available. So, and then the level of transparency and their user friendliness of the interface, that can strongly influence whether stakeholders adopt these tools. For instance, how easy is for a producer group or a cooperative to enter data, to see the results, and the trust necessary for those estimates or negotiations. Then there's a few takeaways. There's no widely preferred methodology. Pragmatism often determines which approach is chosen. The stakeholders' engagement is very important. In the World Banana Forum, we have all the constituencies represented, so it's important to have that level of cooperation and involvement and inclusiveness from different members. And then the context matters. For example, smallholder cooperatives may want a more localized approach, while maybe large exporters, they rely on more general models. So that's also something that we are supposed to bear in mind in the World Banana Forum. Then if we have a living income initiative, the way it could be structured is this will include like technical guidance. Our objective will be to straightforward materials and training for workers, producers, retailers, and other stakeholders to measure incomes, and then that could be useful for their activities. And then workshops and custom materials. So as usual in the World Banana Forum, conduct capacity building sessions to ensure that farmers understand what we are doing, but also that retailers can also use these results and understand these results, which will be useful for their commercial activities. Then almost last slide, Esteban, important pros and cons. I would say that are standardized as a pro, as benefits. I mentioned this before, but we think that a standardized approach in improving consistency in negotiations or discussions about fair prices is important to have this, and maybe we can work together on how to have this standardized approach, and then tailored guidance for stakeholders, helping them to adapt to local conditions, and then how we can bring more data-driven clarity to the sector, which is something missing. Then cons, so then risk of conflict, confusion may arise between living wage initiatives or living income initiatives. Then data constraints, as mentioned before, data constraints because real on-the-ground data is often inconsistent. And then market exclusion, very important. Setting certain thresholds for living income made involuntarily marginalized smallholders, no, or smallholder productions, or even locations, no. So we also need to be mindful if we work in the direction that our work in the World Banana Forum in general, in the banana industry, is to develop a thoughtful, inclusive framework that mitigates this risk and promote collaborative solutions. And then just to finish, we also need to ensure that the mechanisms to achieve living income are available to avoid unintended consequences, as mentioned before, and we need to address these data gaps that are in occasions an issue for the industry and for our studies. So again, in the World Banana Forum, we are committed to work on data harmonization and methodology reviews to implement pilot projects and activities on living income in banana producing regions. So I think I stick to the time. Did I, Stefan?
Yes, Marta, Richard, Bayene, and Victor for like these very educational presentations. We have like a little less than 25 minutes for questions, and also probably like some time for Katia to respond to all the input that she has received from you. So, but first, like I will give the floor to the people that's here in the room with us to ask questions to either Katia or any of our panelists. Actually, we have already a question submitted by someone that is here, Isabel Parras, who is also a colleague from ESA. So Isabel, you can go ahead.
Hi. Thank you. The first thing that I want to say is to say thank you to all of you for this, organizing this and sharing your work. And my question is about the method. It's about the methodology. So it's for Katia. And I was thinking about what is the concept of the reference family, if it's only one reference family, or if it's calculated based on where the study is being done, and if this makes it, and if this reference family allows to compare the living income between different parts. And I had another question that I put into the chat, but it's quick. And I wanted to know also if the living income, it's easy to update, or if it's very survey data based, because it could be good that it could incorporate inputs being more expensive because of ash shock or things like that. Thank you.
Thank you. Katia, you can go ahead first. Maybe also Martha and Richard would like to answer because it's related to their methodology, right? Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, for the reference family, I would just point out that, well, one, we had to be kind of light on details in the presentation. So there's a lot more than in these methods than what was presented in the slides here. It was mostly the highlights, and same for the paper. But indeed, the reference family or the reference household needs to be contextually defined. And that's so that can be based on secondary data, that can be based on available information for a given context. In our Cameroon study, for example, it's 5.2 members. Now, I think Richard and Martha can also comment on that, because there is some guidance on how that is defined for the studies that they have developed. And also, I think you have considerable experience on how to update the living income benchmarks. So I'll hand the floor over to you if you'd like to respond to that point.
Okay.
Yeah, the first one about the reference family size. The reference family size, the way we do it is that it's for the location. And so it'll be a rural area, let's say, in a certain region or wherever we're dealing with. And it would be a combination of looking at how many children people are having, which is the total fertility rate, reduced by mortality, child mortality, to get surviving children, which many parts of the world doesn't matter, but mortality is low. But in Africa, mortality is still high, so it matters. And then looking at how much is the average household size observed, all this from secondary data. And and then a judgment is to be made between the two, between the average household size observed, where we eliminate small households because they don't have children, one person households. So our family size would probably for Cameroon would be 5.5, I would guess, but we would have had not very different from what Katia mentioned. So it's but I think one thing is that these equivalence scales that people are using to go in the living income sphere to go between different family sizes. We decided on one family size, and it was a nuclear family because we're dealing with wages. And if you change the size of the family to go to more extended size families and bigger families, multiple couples, then you start to change the number of workers in the family at the same time. They simultaneously change. So you get, let's say, your older brother or your brother and sister who are workers. So if we have a problem if we try and change the numerator and denominator family size and then our workers. And so that's why we, as a rule, take the nuclear family. When you come to living income, it's a little bit different. And I think that there is a lot of discussion of people liking to use lots of different family sizes, a matrix of family sizes. Our problem is that if we go to multiple family sizes like that, then we get a race to the bottom. Everybody chooses the smallest family size and the lowest living wage. And then living income, I think you have a similar problem, but there could be a little more flexibility into looking at that in terms of the concept.
Yeah.
And then
Updating.
we update every year all of our estimates, and we have around 250 now for inflation. So it keeps its purchasing power. And that's relatively easy to do. For wages, a little bit harder because we have to look at taxes, which is a real problem. For living income, it's easier, but we do that annually.
We're also considering thinking about development levels and thinking about updating it also for development. Or anyway, we were thinking about that before last week. Now it may change if the world is going into a recession.
Right.
We
The idea is that obviously, let's say Cameroon is going to have higher living income than Ethiopia, and Brazil is higher than Cameroon. So as countries develop, their living incomes go up, and therefore, independent of inflation and purchasing power, you get increasing over time. So we're trying to look into how we could do that on a smooth basis, rather than redoing the studies, rebasing the studies, which we do every 10 years.
Thank you, Martin, Richard. So I don't know if anyone in the room has another question to either one Katia or like the discussants. No? Okay, so I think we can go to those that were posted in the chat. And the first one that we were here, well, it's an anonymous attendee, but he has like a doubt related to how similar is the Anker methodology to the measurement poverty. So what he mentioned, or he or she mentioned, is like he's still not sure how both conceptually and in practice the living income from Anker is different from the poverty line calculation. To the attendee, the extreme poverty line is equal to subsistence line or like extreme poverty line, and the general poverty line would be equivalent to the decent living income. So he's confused. He would like for you to elaborate what are the differences, both conceptually and in detail, because to them they're exactly to the concept that was proposed by Deaton, and that it's been used even from the 80s. So I guess Martin, Richard, again, probably you can respond to.
Before working on living wage, living income, I spent a long time and written a lot on poverty. So I'm very familiar with poverty literature and how poverty is measured. And this is I would call it an improvement on poverty into a decency level. So the way poverty is measured is that they have a diet model diet, which is based on calories. Generally, that's how it's done, on number of calories. They're really, in most poverty lines, don't care whether it's a nutritious or a good diet. It's a diet, and whatever people are eating and spending. So the first difference is that we have a normative standard of a model diet that has to be nutritious. It's low cost, but it's nutritious. So that would be one deviation from the poverty line, which would just get a diet that have enough calories. The second difference is that the poverty lines then multiply that value of their food cost by what Engel's law, or Engel's curve, if you would, which is the percent that's not spent on food and non-food. So you just get the multiplication to get from food to non-food and then to total. The difference is that we separate out housing from the non-food and treat it in a normative fashion. So non-food becomes, housing becomes a decent house, not the house that they have necessarily, but a decent house. And then we look at the cost of that decent house. So that's the second difference, is that we have then a decency standard and cost for housing. And then when you come to the non-food, non-housing, it's somewhat similar to the idea of the poverty lines, in that we take the ratio of what's left over, on the idea that it's not necessarily the need isn't the same level of human right or human need as food and housing. And we do that for a part of the distribution that's not poor. They're not wealthy, but not poor. So it's to see how much people are spending on everything else but housing and food. But the difference from that is that we then look at healthcare and education separately, as the Kathy explained that they were doing. And we make sure that enough money is for healthcare and education from our primary data collection for someone who goes through secondary school all the way. The children go all the way through secondary school, and they have adequate healthcare. So we make sure that the healthcare and the education are up at a decency level, even if the secondary data says they are not. So if no one goes to school, or very few people, they will spend very little on education. And that will be reflected in that non-part that the poverty line does. It probably takes just what people ever spend. Doesn't matter if it's high or low. But we separate out these two parts, healthcare and education, and just make sure they at a decency level. So that's the difference. So you have a decency level for four things. And I think that's but just to be a little bit
And a buffer.
And then a buffer as well as above that. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, we can go over, but we have to move with the other questions. Thank you very much. So, Chris Whitehouse, he congratulated everyone for the presentation, and he asked whether is there any cross crop or cross geography information on the extent to which improper farming practice widens the living income gap. Like, for instance, he said a cacao farmer who relies upon low-cost agroecological measures may experience a smaller living income gap than one who relies upon expensive, though not necessarily more effective agrochemical inputs. So hence, so even within the same crop farming context, rural households may have may experience different, vulnerability. So yeah, I guess this is to everyone, because it's a post related study. So I don't know whether either Katya or Bayane that haven't answered. Katya, yes.
I want to say something. I mean, the living income gap method doesn't necessarily consider those specific contexts, but it's implicit in the estimation of income. So the income estimate that enters into the living income gap indicator is a net income estimation. So that considers all sources of revenues, but also all costs associated with those income generating activities. So the farmer that's spending less on its inputs because it's using agroecological approaches will have a higher income, ceteris paribus, all other things equal, as compared to the farmer that's investing in all these purchased agrochemicals and facing higher costs and maybe not higher output. So in the estimation of the actual incomes, so that Y variable in the equation, so the actual incomes, the cost elements are considered. Also, the production elements are considered. And all of that comes together to get at that net total income for the reference household or for any unit that's being analyzed. So it's implicit, but it's not broken out specifically. And I think there's a potential for conducting analysis around this. Maybe Beyene has some comments as well, since he's been working on the living income gap quite a bit.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much. In fact, the living income benchmark is a measure of or is a threshold or the cost that's required to lead decent living in a certain locality. So we do a benchmarking for a certain locality. So that locality, that benchmark shows the amount of income required to lead a decent living in that particular area. So take into account all communities who are living around that area. Therefore, living income benchmark is really an indicator to see how the cost of living or cost of leading a decent living in that particular area. Then we assess living income benchmark to see the gap. We assess living benchmark gaps to see the gap and also find ways to bridge the gap. So benchmarking is like a threshold that is required to lead a decent living in a given locality, and actual income is income earned by individual. So when we calculate the living income gap, then we will see how the smallholders of that particular area is far from attaining their decent living. That is how we conceptualize living income benchmarking in rural areas and its importance.
Thank you, Beyene. Then the last, well, it's not necessarily a question, but it comes from Gini Owani, and he mentions that the focus should be on smallholder farmers or producers who the majority of his livelihood come from, or we are concerned with, no? But cash crops such as coffee and cocoa are mainly grown by commercial farmers. So focusing on such cash crops would be representative of the situation of the study areas. I would respond very quickly that probably tomorrow will be clearer why, because these measures that we are presenting today are actually, well, two things. First of all, that's not necessarily true, because there are cooperatives that actually buy to small producers, in this specifically these value chains. And second, like precisely these measures that we have presented today are linked to strategies that that we will learn more tomorrow. So just that, and I will give the last 5 minutes to Katya, who to probably want to give like a last overview to all the comments and input that she has received from the discussion. So over, the floor is yours, Katya. Over.
There's this one very interesting question in the chat. I don't know if you'd like to.
Sorry. Yes, sorry. Just arrived now. So Belén Rivadeneira says this question to Victor Prada, and she asked whether is there a guideline on CS3D on living income measurement.
On CS triple D, you said?
Yes.
Oh, I wish. No, there's no guidance. I mean, CS triple D, I mean, the reporting requirements will come from the CSRD, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. That's in the hands of an entity hired by the Parliament called EFRAG. And EFRAG is working in that direction. As you know, this week, all of those activities, CSDDD, the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, and the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive have been postponed. So for 2 and 3 years. So I wish we will have guidance provided by the European Commission or the CSDDD, but this is not yet. We are not there yet. Although we are working on carbon and water footprint in that direction with the European Commission, and we have precisely tomorrow a meeting with Yagi on the matter. So maybe the objective for the European Commission will be to go in that direction in the future.
Thank you, Victor. So now, as I mentioned, I want to give like last 5 minutes either to Katia or Katarina, Pascal that are also joining us here, if they want to, in 5 minutes give some comments about the points that have been raised by the discussions today. I don't know whether you would like to.
Thanks, Esteban. I would invite Pascal or Katerina if you'd like to share your thoughts or any reactions. You're welcome to speak up. So please let us know right now if you would like to.
Hello.
Yeah.
Yes. Nice to meet you all, and thank you, Katia. No, I won't be long. No, I just wanted, to stand a bit for our work, and I know you didn't have time to explain all the process, and also this part of the first stages. We did work a bit on our own, but there was, just to make sure and to remind, that we did an extensive work with the local stakeholders, especially in the definition of the nutritious and local diet. So that explained maybe why some of the particular items were included versus others. But that's I think it's important to stress that this was a result of this very inclusive work together with the stakeholders, and that's not our decision, but definitely based on the local contextualized diet. So that explains a lot this, and we thought that it was not up to us to decide whether we would include bushmeat or not, for instance, but up to the local stakeholders. So we had long exchanges with local experts, nutritionists, organization working in the sector of food security and so on, and then a workshop, 2 days workshop in Yaoundé in Cameroon to discuss and revise and define all this, and not only for the diet but also for the other components. The same we did with the housing, long discussion on how many rooms we should include in the decent house. So this was quite extensive, and in our opinion quite well conducted. So just to thank you.
Thank you, Pascal. Katarina?
Hi, yes,
You'd like-
hello, and everyone. Sorry, my camera's, I don't know what's going on, but it's not working. But I don't really have very much to add. Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, it's true that we used the 2017 Anker and Anker book. I read it probably 100 times back and forth. And yes, possibly it requires potentially an update. We didn't indeed go through all of the available living income benchmark studies that have been done. We certainly consulted the ones on cocoa specifically, and also other cash crops actually, to also see how it was actually implemented in practice. But as has been mentioned, there's this balance between making sure there's consistency for comparability, but also this flexibility of making also a living benchmark that has implications for how local stakeholders assess a decent standard of living for a specific value chain, for a specific, or producers in a specific value chain, and to make it as country specific as possible. So there's always this balance that hopefully we have achieved. But honestly, all these comments are more than welcome. As Katja has mentioned, we're still very much in the process of writing the report, and that will be, of course, much more detailed on all the methodological aspects. So we're happy to make sure that that's shared. And now I've taken all the time off from Katja, so I apologize.
No, thank you very much, Katarina. And well, I think this is it. We will close the event. But before, I wanted to invite you and remind you that this was only day 1, and tomorrow we have day 2, where we will be, looking at the strategies that are there to close the gap that we learned today. No, so we will have a presentation by representatives from Fair Trade, and then to discussants similar to today, the same time at the same room. So colleagues, you are invited to join as well, or the ones that didn't come today, we invite you to come. Thank you very much, and see you tomorrow. Bye.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
you.
Thanks. Bye.